What is up, freaks? It's your boy Marty Bent here to introduce this episode of Tales from the Crypt. I sat down with Dominic Frisby, author of Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. It's not the only book he's written. He's written other books as well. We sat down to talk about taxes, the history of taxes, the violence behind taxes, and how they may change in a world in which Bitcoin becomes the dominant reserve currency. Talked about a bunch of other things, Bitcoin demonetizing gold to a certain extent. It's fun rip, Friday afternoon rip. Finally getting it out on Wednesday. So I hope you guys enjoy it. It's brought to you by our good friends at the motherfucking Cash App. Cash App's helping you stack sats, send sats, receive sats, sell sats. We're saying sats, because sats are the standard, all right? There are 100 million sats in each Bitcoin. If you guys have been listening, you know this, but we gotta beat it home. I just had I was on somebody else's podcast. They're asking me, why should I buy Doge? Why shouldn't we buy Doge? Why should we buy Bitcoin? Doge is 5 cents. Like, what happens if it goes to $1? That's a 20x. They don't understand. They're using unit bias. They think they see Doge at 5 cents, Bitcoin at $57,000. And they're like, oh, it's so cheap compared to Bitcoin. They don't understand. Doge doesn't have the incentives. The network effects, it is tail inflation into infinity. It is not the same as Bitcoin. $57,000 Bitcoin is extremely cheap, and one sat is cheaper than one Doge. 100 million sats in a Bitcoin. Cash App's help you stack sats. You can DCA into it, buy a certain amount daily, weekly, bi-weekly. Cash App will be your bank account. They're offering account numbers, routing numbers. You can direct deposit your paychecks, stack sats right away. If you haven't downloaded the Cash App, make sure you do so. Use the code STACKINGSATS. That's S-A... How do you spell stacking sats? Not S-A. S-T-A-C-K-I-N-G-S-A-T-S. You're going to get $10, and $10 is going to go to our good friends at Owls Lacrosse. That's Owls Lacrosse. Owls Lacrosse. This episode is also brought to you by good friends at Hodl Hodl. Hodl Hodl is creating a Bitcoin lending platform. Excuse me, not Bitcoin. Can you lend Bitcoin? Yeah. Whatever. They have a new lending product. It's available to U.S. customers. If you don't want to sell your Bitcoin, that's the point I'm trying to make. You don't have to, okay? You can put your Bitcoin up as collateral and get liquid Tether or other types of stable coins so that you can get liquidity and not have to sell your Bitcoin. And the best part is it's non-custodial. There's no KYC. You're engaging in a multi-sig escrow contract with a counterparty. You always hold one key. You never lose control of your Bitcoin. There's going to be no rehypothecation. You go and you meet peers on Hodl Hodl's marketplace. You engage and you agree on terms. You put your Bitcoin in a multi-sig. You get some stable coins. You're able to go spend that however you wish. You don't have to sell your Bitcoin. On top of that, if you have stable coins and you want to get some yield on that, you can put it up in this marketplace and get some yield on that on the other side of this. So go to lend.hodlhodl.com. That's lend.hodlhodl.com. Check out all this. Again, it's available to U.S. customers. So if you're in the U.S. and you want a non-custodial KYC-free way to get liquidity for Bitcoin that you don't want to sell, lend.hodlhodl.com. So this is also brought to you by good friends at Compass Mining. Compass Mining is helping to democratize hash rate. They want the little man to get in on the game, and what they do is they go and they set up partnerships with large hosting facilities. They get you a good rate, electricity rate, cost per kilowatt hour. They get it down so it's profitable. They help you acquire miners. They plug them in, and then they start streaming sats to you. All right, they want to democratize hash rate and let the little guy get in and help distribute individual hash producers. The more individual hash producers, the better. Our friends at Compass Mining are enabling you freaks to do that. So again, they're taking out all the hard work, all the dirty work. They're taking away the confusion from you. They're abstracting that away, and their team is working to just make it as seamless as possible for you to interact with them, buy a miner, have it plugged in at a hosting facility at a competitive cost per kilowatt hour rate, and have you get sats streamed to you via mining instead of buying via KYC AML. It's a cool way to get in. And if mining is extremely profitable as it is now, as the difficulty just adjusted downward, You can get sats potentially cheaper. Not a guarantee. That was not in the ad copy. This is Uncle Marty speaking. Go to compassmining.io. That's compassmining.io. Check out everything they have going on. We're going to have links to all of our sponsored deals in the show notes. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you guys enjoy this episode with Dominic. If you're liking the podcast, the content we're putting out, please subscribe, rate, review. If you are so kind to do so, we would really appreciate it. It helps us get more exposure, helps people get better Bitcoin content in front of them. We don't need people pumping Doge, okay? We need people stacking sats. And so we need to get this good content in front of them. Love all y'all. Tiki.
You've had a dynamic where money's become freer than free.
If you talk about a Fed just gone nuts, all the central banks going nuts.
So it's all acting like safe haven.
I believe that in a world where central bankers are tripping over themselves to devalue their currency, Bitcoin wins. In the world of fiat currencies, Bitcoin is the victor.
I mean, that's part of the bull case for Bitcoin.
If you're not paying attention, you probably should be.
What is up, freaks? Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. It's your boy Marty Bent here on a lovely Friday afternoon, sitting down with a guest who's been putting out incredible content for years, some content that has helped me come to understand Bitcoin back in the early days when I was first getting into it. Bitcoin, the future of money. I'm sitting down with prolific author Dominic Frisby. Dominic, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Marty, and thanks very much for having me on.
Thanks for coming. I mean, again, like I said, because were you at Max Kaiser a lot back in the day as well?
Yeah, I was. Basically, whenever I write a book, I try and go on as many shows as possible in order to promote the book. And one of the shows that I went on was Max Kaiser's show, and then and that was my first book, Life After the State. And I'd written a film that was very popular called Four Horsemen back in the day, or co-wrote it, and I think I was on Max's show talking about that as well. And then when I wrote Bitcoin, the Future of Money, I thought I had the scoop on who Satoshi Nakamoto, who he is or was. And so I went on Max and we sort of did the big reveal on Max's show. I realized, by the way, that it's totally immoral to do that, but you know.
That's your latest book, Daylight Robbery. Like I was telling you, I've been reading it when I can over the last month since you first reached out to me, and I'm about 4.5 chapters in. I think it's a fascinating subject, one that Bitcoiners think about a lot. Taxes. Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future is the title of the book, and there's a history of taxation, and you seem to believe that it's something that we're never going to escape, but it can be minimized to a point. And maybe we could talk about towards the end of the conversation how Bitcoin plays into that minimization of tax. But I think the whole history is fascinating. Again, like in the beginning of the book, going into the tax structure in England and how tax collectors would look in windows. People started boarding up their windows so they couldn't see in, and people were combining chimneys. And you can tell this story much better than me. I guess we could start with why you decided to write the book and things you learned or important.
Sure, I'd be glad to. And when I wrote Four Horsemen and Life After the State and Bitcoin, I was convinced that, you know, in a zombie film, you have a zero patient zero. That's the bat in China. That's the first person to get the virus. And the hero of the zombie film's got to go and get to patient zero. And either patient zero gives him the antidote, or patient zero, he has to kill patient zero, and then he ends the virus and saves the world. And I was convinced that so many, like I was a gold bug for many years before Bitcoin came around. I still like gold. And, you know, so the whole fiat money narrative, you know, was very, very apparent to me even in 2007 before Bitcoin had been invented. And I think Satoshi was probably a gold bug as well, because one of his aims was to digitally replicate gold. But anyway, I was convinced that if we're going to save the world, if we're going to save the West, if we're going to save society, if government's going to start living within its means again, all these things, you know, the only reason that government has been able to grow so big, the only reason that those wars in the 20th century were able to go on for as long as they did and to the extent that they did was fiat money. Fiat money is the zero patient, and we have to get rid of it. And, you know, I've just wrote so much. I became obsessed about it. And then after I finished Bitcoin, I took a sort of 6 months off from writing books or whatever. And I just started to think more and more about it. And I started to develop this theory that, in fact, it's taxation is the zero patient. That's not to say we don't need to solve the ills of fiat money. Oh boy, do we need to solve them. And, you know, thank goodness the free market in the form of Bitcoin has come up with a solution, the most wonderful collective effort in the history of mankind. It's, you know, if ever there's an advert for voluntary collectivism, it's Bitcoin. And that's very difficult from coerced collectivism, which is, you know, socialism. Anyway, I mean, Bitcoin is socialist, except everyone's doing it voluntarily rather than, and they're all united by the goal of profit. It's a higher Bitcoin prices. It's a wonderfully uniting force. And so the psychological dynamics of Bitcoin are amazing. But anyway, I started to become convinced that tax is patient zero. You design there's never been a society in all human history that existed without taxation of some kind. Taxation is as old as civilization itself. The very first written records we have are tax records. And in fact, tax records, you look at something like the Rosetta Stone, it's a tax document. Tax records tend to be the best preserved. You know, historians always go to the tax records because they tend to be well preserved for obvious reasons, because government revenue depends on it. And in fact, taxation is power. It is control. If a government or a king or an emperor or whatever the ruler is loses control of their tax revenue, they lose their power. And so taxation is everything. And in fact, the idea of a sense of duty to the greater collective, it probably existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. In fact, it's built into us because, you know, the first thing you do is look after your own survival, make sure you eat and drink and get shelter. And the first thing you do after that is look after the survival of the species, which is, you know, you reproduce. So anyway, so once you start to look at the world through this prism of taxation and you realize that you design a society by the way that you tax it. And in fact, you can learn about a society by the way that it's taxed. You determine how free or subordinated the people are by how they're taxed. You determine how prosperous that society is going to be. Taxation is a measure of freedom. You know, there's a big argument with Bitcoin is going on about money, but there's a huge cultural war going on about free speech, free thought, censorship, free movement. You know, they're all related. And Thatcher used to say, you can't have freedom unless you have economic freedom. And once you start to look at the world through this taxes power narrative, you start to realize that pretty much any great event in history had some kind of tax story behind it, without which that event would have unfolded in a very different way. Every war was made possible by tax. Every revolt was rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. Every conquest was about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labor, the produce, the profits. Even things like religions, you know, which in the old days were a system of governance, but they were also built on, you know, Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem to pay taxes. Islam expanded so rapidly and so quickly because it relieved the conquered people of taxes, and they were given a choice. You either convert to Islam and pay no poll tax, or you pay the poll tax, and if you don't pay the poll tax, we'll kill you. So it's death taxes or Islam, and everyone chose Islam, and Islam expanded incredibly rapidly. And, you know, the first men on the moon were put there because NASA was a taxpayer-funded operation. And you start to realize that the whole of human history has been shaped by tax one way or the other. And then you start to look at the world today and you can see, oh, well, the inequality gap, why is the inequality gap so difficult? Why is there such an age gap between generations? And then you realize that young people are taxed heavily by income tax, and then the money they're paid in is taxed via the inflation tax. Meanwhile, wealth assets that they want to buy, houses and so on, go untaxed and actually benefit from inflation because debasement of money pushes up their value. And there, right there, you see the dynamic of the inequality gap. It's caused by taxation. And then once you start to look at things like this, you just see how the future is going to pan out, and how if you're designing a society, if you start by redesigning its system of tax and then go from there, the rest will take care of itself.
Yeah, another interesting thing you bring up in the beginning of the book too is like tax's effect on family formation, like making it too expensive to actually procreate and have a family. I mean, it's detrimental to the growth of our society to a certain extent, right? And so,
oh my goodness me, the most, when you ask, like, there's a sort of underclass in society that are heavily subsidized by the state and are able to reproduce at will and have all their kids paid for. But the sort of lower middle classes, upper working classes, middle classes, whatever you want to call them, the most commonly given reason why they don't have more than 1 or 2 kids is they can't afford it. And then you say, what is the most expensive purchase that these people make in their life? And it isn't a house, as most people believe. It is their government. Your government, you know, over the course of your life, roughly 50% of everything you ever earn is taken from you in taxes. And, you know, it's the reason, you know, Keynes predicted that, 100 odd years ago, that we'd all be working, I can't remember what it was, 6 or 8 or 12-hour weeks, and we'd be living a life of leisure because of increased productivity. And all, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, food, clothing, and shelter made up something like 80% of the money we spend, and now it's 20 to 30%, something like that. And the huge expense that's ballooned that Keynes didn't see coming when he made that prediction was the expense of the state. And it's that expense of the state. It's so much people cannot afford to have bigger families. They're also having smaller families because it tends to be, the more developed you get, the you have fewer kids because, you know, fewer of them are going to die, so you don't need to have as many, and people are protecting their own leisure time and so on. All those narratives are true, but the single biggest reason is kids are expensive, and so people have fewer of them.
Yeah,
and they have them later in life as well.
No, and I like that you, like, we're taxed in 2 ways, right? Like overt taxes that the IRS here in the United States collects, and then the inflation tax, which is imbued on us by the central banks and their monetary policy, which is getting more and more insane by the day. So you're taxed officially and then unofficially by the debasement of the currency. And again, I mean, you mentioned this is why Bitcoin exists and why I like to focus on Bitcoin and have this podcast, because I think it's important for people to understand how this all works and what is actually driving the inequality. Like I like to say, fix the money, fix the world. Like, so like, again, like fixing the tax structure, fixing the inflation tax, as well as the overt tax on the government is going to go a long way. And
I think money is part of it, is a key part, but it's part of a bigger story, which is taxation.
Yeah,
that's the narrative I'm pushing. And by the way, you forgot the third big tax there, which is debt, the tax on the future.
Right. You pull
the
that
most insidious
forward,
of the lot.
Right. And so how would you recommend, like, and that's the other thing, like taxes, at least here in America, people love taxes, it seems, especially the people in power right now. They want to raise taxes. Everybody seems to think that the uber wealthy need to give back in the form of wealth tax, and they're talking about taxing unrealized gains here. It's a concept that's being thrown around, and because they think it will fix the problem of inequality that is growing in our society. Why do you think? Why is there this mainstream misconception and misdiagnosing of the problem, where they seem to be hell-bent on making the problem worse by taxing more, where they should arguably be taxing less and letting the free markets sort things out?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the idea of what is it? What did you call it?
Unrealized gains tax.
Unrealized gains tax. God blimey, that's just terrible. I doubt they'll get that through, but I've heard the argument. It's a wealth tax. It's a wealth tax, and the good thing about wealth tax is they're actually they sound easy in principle, but they're actually quite difficult to do in practice. And so, I mean, the thing about income taxes is an easy tax to collect. And we tend to think of income tax as a new thing, and it is by the name of income tax. You know, the British brought it in the Napoleonic Wars. America introduced it in your Civil War, and Lincoln introduced it to pay for the Union effort. And then it went away in 1875 or something. It was brought back in 1913, but it only really hit ordinary Americans in 1942 with the Revenue Act of 1942, which was introduced to pay for another war effort.
Right, and it's always temporary.
Yeah, exactly. And you need a crisis to get the tax introduced, and then once the tax is introduced, it never goes away. But the reality is income tax is like the oldest tax of the lot. It's the tithe, and the tithe, you know, where you gave a tenth of your labor or a tenth of your produce. And the tithe predates Christianity, by the way. We think as a Christian tax. And by the way, they say it's a tithe because you've got 10 fingers on your hand, and it was the 10th. It was an easy number to calculate. But the principle of the tithe, again, goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. And so, and the tithe is effectively an income tax. And so, yeah, it's an old form of tax, but you know, there's a great quote from George Bernard Shaw about how taxation works, and it is: a government voting to rob Peter to pay Paul can always count on the support of Paul.
Right.
And you know, that just sums it up. And so all these lobbying for higher taxes, it's almost, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's taxing other people and not us. And it's as much about getting the money as it is about getting control. You know, so much of this large state movement that's mostly on the left, but to a certain extent on the right, is just, it's about control. No, you can't say this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't think of these things. And very interesting little historical tidbit: the censor, the word censor, as in censorship, the censor was a magistrate in ancient Rome who was responsible for maintaining public morality, but also collecting taxes. And so there's this, I talked about the relationship between tax and freedom, but, you know, even etymologically, it's there. And the word census, as in, you know, Augustus Caesar levied a census, and that's why Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem. You know, census is a measure of who's who. Censuses were levied in order to levy poll taxes. So census, censorship, taxes, there's a lot of crossover in the Venn diagram, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, yeah, all throughout history, you have the tax collectors in ancient Rome, the tithe from the church. It's again, like the Paul obviously wants the tax revenue from Peter, so they think it will make life better. But it's like we have too much data to prove that, like, the taxes have only gotten more burdensome here in the US, particularly, in quality of society has gone down. And this is in the face of deflationary pressures from in the technology sector, which have made access to information and the ability to bootstrap game-changing apps and products like possible. But even in the face of this, we have this growing wealth inequality, and some people would say desperation, right? You have opioid deaths at all-time highs, you have suicide rising, you have obesity at all-time highs. It's a very unhealthy society, which is becoming unhealthier in the face of all these great technological and productivity advancements. It's a bit counterintuitive.
And the curious thing is, the bigger government gets, the worse things like inequality get. And yet the solution is more government. It's never less government. We didn't do this. We didn't quantitative ease enough. We need to do more quantitative easing. We need more state controls. And, you know, the system of taxation, the system of society as it is currently designed, causes inequality. You know, income tax and inflation, between them, are the two single greatest causes of inequality in the West. And full stop.
Right.
They really are. And yet the solution is more income tax and more inflation, not less.
Do you think people are starting to wake up? I think last year was a big wake up call. You lock down everybody. And then the Fed printing so much money last year, specifically, and people being locked in their homes and watching this on TV and on the internet as they can't go to work and they're able to pay more attention to it. You saw the question pop up, like, if the Federal Reserve can print all this money, like, why do we even pay taxes? Like, people starting to question just the function of how money is produced and distributed, and then question taxes and how they're collected. Do you think there's an opportunity to basically take advantage of the cultural lack of confidence in our institutions to get people to wake up and say, hey, maybe we should lower taxes and bring this back to a free market society?
Well, I think this is where Bitcoin is just doing the most phenomenal job. Like, I said I was aware of the whole fiat currency narrative in the noughties, and I used to write about it a lot. But just explaining to people how money worked, how money's created, how it causes inequality, it was just so difficult. And I'm a pretty good communicator. I think I'm pretty good at explaining stuff. And it was just so hard to, and the only place that this narrative was finding any exposure was in the gold price. The more gold kept going up, the more people became aware of it. But then suddenly Bitcoin came along, and it's just turned so many people into millionaires overnight, and multimillionaires and billionaires. And there's a movement behind it, which is, it is a new religion. And, people criticize Bitcoin because it's become like a religion, but there's nothing, everyone has belief systems. There's nothing wrong with belief systems. There are good belief systems. There are good religions, particularly early in their evolution. They only get corrupted later on. But it's just been the most powerful tool to get the money story out there and get the message out. And every time the Bitcoin price goes up another $500 or $1,000, whatever it is, the narrative is confirmed. And, it doesn't matter how many articles the Financial Times or the BBC or whatever your equivalents in the USA write saying, it's just for speculators and drug dealers. It doesn't matter how much FUD there is. The price keeps going up. The narrative gets confirmed. More people get interested. It's a natural human instinct to want to improve your lot. And at the moment, the Bitcoin economy is the best way to do that. It's the best way to improve your circumstance. And so you start investing in Bitcoin, and once you start investing in Bitcoin, you go down the rabbit hole. You start following all the people who talk about Bitcoin and social media and so on. And the whole thing just keeps growing bigger and bigger, and the message gets stronger and stronger, and the narrative gets stronger. And so that is playing a huge role in this. And, there is a huge anti-taxation, not anti-taxation necessarily, but anti-large state movement in Bitcoin, because the thing was born in reaction to money printing and too much state. And so, that's how the narrative will go. And what you're noticing with Bitcoin is I don't think you can change government. I think it's just entrenched. And the journey you have to go through to just get this tiniest detail of, some clause of some law changed. It's, years of lobbying and this and that. It's so slow. And yet, Bitcoin's like, it's almost created another digital land that you can just go to. And, where these laws, these old systems don't apply. And, more and more Bitcoiners, you see, there's so many Bitcoiners are digital nomads. There are lots of Americans who indeed have renounced their own citizenship, but people are voting with their feet. So they're leaving, New York and California, whatever it is, and they're going to Texas and Florida, and then they're going to Mexico, and then they'll go to Colombia, and then they'll, and the same process that's happening in America is happening everywhere. The rise of the digital nomad. And the tax system is designed around an industrial economy where people and goods were stuck within the borders of one nation state. They were easy to control and tax and regulate. The crypto economy is a different beast altogether. and it's going to prove much, much harder to tax, particularly as people conduct their labor from jurisdictions that aren't their nationality. In other words, it's slightly different for Americans, because Americans have this thing that wherever you are in the world, you have to pay tax to America. And in fact, if you marry someone, they've got to pay tax to America as well, I recently discovered. And that's a law that goes back to the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, who was trying to protect Union tax revenue, and so he brought that law in. And of course, like many laws that get introduced in times of crisis, as you said earlier, they don't get abandoned afterwards. So anyway, so it's slightly different for Americans, but it's still a big move. And there are plenty of Americans like Roger Ver and so on who've just left. So that's a big dynamic, the growth of the digital economy and the inability of governments to tax and regulate it to the same extent that they do their own physical economies.
Yeah. And that's, again, bringing it back to a point you made earlier, where everything's done to accumulate power. Yes, they accumulate a lot of money, but at the end of the day, behind accumulating that money via taxation, whether it be overt taxation or inflation taxation, is power over the populace. And that's one thing I love about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a money for enemies, whether you're left or right, or no matter what your nationality is, your religion, Bitcoin just works for you, no matter what your worldview is or your life experiences. And also, in my experience, is just helping people realize,
if you're a statist and you believe that tax should be 50% of GDP, you can still give 50% of your profits away. Nobody's stopping you.
Nobody is. No, but one thing I love about Bitcoin is people get into it and they learn about these properties, and comparing it to the false narrative they've been fed and the false framing they've been fed for some time, red team versus blue team here in the United States. And at the end of the day, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. They're all the same. They're all looking for that power, and Bitcoin takes that power away from them and really highlights. And we actually have more in common, the people that are being pitted against each other via the media and the political system, like Black Lives Matter and the people storming the Capitol earlier this year, even though they probably don't realize it and wouldn't like to admit it. They have more in common with each other than they do with the people in power at the monetary and political level. And Bitcoin really highlights that, because you get people from all over the political spectrum coming to Bitcoin for its properties, and then having conversations with each other and be like, hey, yeah, like, you know what, maybe it is these guys that are making all the laws and the rules and taking our money that are the problem. It's not red team versus blue team. It's not the other. It's this particular structure that's been erected.
Yeah, Milton Friedman used to say that the best way to get enemies to come together is via the free market.
Right.
You know, it really is. You just get people who don't like each other trading and exchanging with each other. They'll get on fine. If you've got something they want and they've got something you want, you trade. You both get on fine. You don't fight.
Right. And that's, especially the U.S. financial system, it's weaponized everything. So it's to eliminate free trade between particular individuals in other countries. Like Venezuela is an example I like to use. Like, they're completely sanctioned, but Bitcoin's allowing Venezuelan expats living in America to send money back. It's allowing American companies to contract out developer work in Venezuela. They can pay them in Bitcoin. It sort of dissolves that artificial border that's been erected via sanctions in the traditional financial system, and allows that free trade to reign free.
Let me ask you a question, Marty, because this is something I've been thinking about. Like, you know, what Venezuela has become is, you know, for all the evils of the United States government, the United States military, and United States sanctions, you know, Venezuela is not a great regime.
Obviously not. No. I'm talking about Venezuela citizens, not Maduro.
Oh, okay. I remember back in the 90s, I used to, I would take every year, I would go away in January, and I would go spend the whole of January. I'd leave on Boxing Day and I'd come back on the 1st of February, and I'd take that sort of 5 or 6 weeks and I'd travel around a Latin American country. And one of the countries I wanted to visit was Venezuela. And the reason I didn't go was because it was too expensive and too middle class. Isn't that incredible compared to then? You know, in the 90s, it was like considered one of the most advanced countries in Latin America. And you look at what it's become now. Anyway, but, you know, hyperinflation, authoritarian governments, all the rest of it, it's not a great place to be.
No.
But if the stuff I'm reading on Twitter is correct, and maybe Twitter isn't the most reliable news source, but I think this is right because I've seen videos of it, the Venezuelan military is using its cheap oil, its cheap energy, to mine bitcoins. So that would mean that the Venezuelan government is acquiring bitcoins.
Oh yeah, they've been doing this for quite a while. So not only they're mining it, they've confiscated miners from Venezuelan citizens. They've basically found out where a lot of energy is being sucked onto the grid, and being like, all right, these are obviously Bitcoin miners, go on, confiscated them, and then plug them in for themselves. They've been doing that for years. And last year, they the Maduro regime like made like the national website for passports, like where to purchase and get your passport, your Venezuelan passport. Like he integrated Bitcoin payments with that as well. So they're collecting Bitcoins via like passport revenue as well.
Okay, so and am I right in saying the Iranian government's doing something similar?
The Iranian government is forcing Bitcoin miners that are registered in the country to give their Bitcoin to the Iranian central bank so that they can buy commodities on the open market and the international markets.
Okay, so the reason that those two governments have got an interest in Bitcoin is partly because they've got cheap energy, but partly because their own currencies are so weak and useless.
Yes, and it's the only like payments communications network that they can access outside of
I think I might be right in saying, I'm not sure I'm entirely accurate, but I think a lot of the Venezuelan gold is stored in Britain, and Venezuela asked for it back and we didn't give it to them.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think they asked for like $10 billion worth of gold, and it got shut down by the ECB, I believe.
So that's an example of, centralized bodies, I suppose.
Yes.
Centralized storage. Anyway, so what this is an example of is, now I do think we're entering some kind of end game for fiat money. Now, I have to say, I keep coming back to this narrative. I've been coming back to it for 15 years that fiat money is entering its end game, and then each time it somehow manages to survive with just losing its purchasing power by 10 or 15%. It never happens. It constantly threatens. But anyway, we're in another one of those periods where it looks like we're in some kind of end game. And the disappointing reality at the sort of national, when you start thinking about national governments owning Bitcoin, is that it's easier for, firstly, those governments whose currencies are weakest tend to be the worst sort of governments, and they tend to be the ones also most motivated to acquire Bitcoin for obvious reasons. The sort of democracies of the West, which are far less authoritarian in that it's more a sort of technocratic government rather than one person in charge. So it's much harder for the central bank, for example, to suddenly decide we're going to acquire Bitcoin. It requires a certain amount of leadership that doesn't exist. There's just too much career risk for a central banker to say something like that. There's all sorts of forms and boxes, and you'd have to face the scrutiny of the media. And all in all, it's much harder for Western democratic governments to acquire Bitcoin than it is for authoritarian regimes like Iran and Venezuela. Now, for all the evils perpetrated by Western government, on the whole, I think it's fair to say they are better than Iranian, better examples of a bad bunch. Some might disagree. So what I'm concerned about is that the power that is owning Bitcoin and owning sound money is going to be disproportionately weighted in the fiat currency endgame to regimes that maybe aren't that benevolent. Do you see what I'm looking at there? What I'm describing?
I see what you're saying, but I think luckily the saving grace in this particular situation is the fact that individual citizens in Western democracies own a good chunk of Bitcoin, and a lot more than the Venezuelan and Iranian regimes, I would garner. Like, yes, they can acquire Bitcoin, but they are inefficient and dumb autocratic regimes at the end of the day. Like Venezuela's miners aren't that efficient. We've seen pictures of them like trying to plug them in, and they may not know how to do it and execute well on that. Iran,
You think they're using ledger wallets to keep their Bitcoins in?
Yeah.
And who's got the keys?
Yeah. Similarly, the Iranian Ayatollahs and central bank that are forcing registered miners to give them their Bitcoin. Like again, like that they force registered miners to give them their Bitcoin, and then the miners in Iran who don't like the government either just drive their operations underground. And yeah, like these regimes are going to have some Bitcoin, whether or not that gives them more leverage on the international power play. I think again the fact that millions of citizens in Western democracies own Bitcoin and hold Bitcoin will curb their effect on and influence in the future. That's actually like I don't want the Fed or the federal government to here in the United States to be accumulating Bitcoin. I think they should take a hands-off approach and just let individual Americans hoard and mine and acquire as much Bitcoin as they can and just get out of the way, which they've done an okay job of doing so far. But there are, of course, individuals in Congress and the Senate who don't like Bitcoin and will try to stop it. But luckily, the West is much richer, and so has been able to acquire more Bitcoin by just buying it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so established in North America now, it's going to be nigh on impossible for them to make it illegal.
Yeah, and then again, so the company I work for outside of the podcast and newsletter, Great American Mining, we go and mine Bitcoin in oil fields using gas that would otherwise be flared. So we actually are helping curb methane emissions in the oil patches over here. And so we're making oil producers more efficient and then more profitable as well. And we're doing it in states that typically take a laissez-faire approach to markets and energy markets specifically. And so once we get more fully ingrained in the oil and gas industry, it's going to be hard to go to that powerful lobby and be like, oh, we're going to make Bitcoin illegal. It's like, well, it's helping us reduce methane emissions and making us much more money. Like, do you really want to take that bread and butter away from us?
You need to get that story out as much as possible. I've made a couple of videos about Bitcoin energy consumption, and I've written about it a lot, and I've attempted to explain it to people. But the green, that sort of authoritarian green narrative will not have it. And, they tend to be quite statist, and, they're using the amount of people that tell me I'm not going to buy Bitcoin because it's environmentally unfriendly and it's immoral. And you're just like, you do not get it. No. You do not get it. It's the opposite. You've got examples like your company that are doing the gas stuff, but I really like this idea that communities are going to get built up, starting with Bitcoin mining operations in obscure parts of the world where there would never have been communities, and they're going to create wealth and then there's also all the use of it's the expansive use of green energy and Bitcoin mining, hydrothermal and all the rest of it is driving investment into those sectors, which is going to cause invention and innovation and all these things, which ultimately is going to result in better, cleaner energy systems for all. And it actually improves the environment and then that's before you get onto all the cost of the environment of all the things that go on with fiat money.
Yeah, you're becoming more efficient. You're seeking out cleaner renewables, and you're bringing a sound monetary standard into the world that reduces the misallocation of capital that's enabled by the fiat monetary system. It's a win-win-win all around. But I agree. The incompetent green terrorist that want to force their view of the world on the rest of us don't like to understand or even hear out the nuance of the subject. But
Where do you stand on gold, Marty, in this unnecessary confrontation between gold bugs and Bitcoin bugs?
I think philosophically gold bugs and Bitcoiners align almost perfectly. Where they diverge is whether or not gold has a place in the future as a store of value. I think the properties of Bitcoin are such that it's just going to suck a lot of the capital that's historically been stored in gold as a store of value asset away from it, just because gold's been completely neutered due to its physical nature. As we mentioned, the fact that the UK won't give Venezuela back its gold, it's just like an evidence of an attack vector that Bitcoin solves.
I think gold in the last 6 months has seen 12 billion of outflows from gold ETFs compared to Bitcoin's 6 billion of inflows. So
Yeah,
a lot of that money's already going out from one to the other.
yeah. And I've had a lot of gold bugs on this podcast in the past, and I love them. We align philosophically like pretty dead on. I think it's hard for people to attempt to understand the possibility that gold could be demonetized because of this new nation digital currency that has the 5,000-year history, obviously, which is like, all right, it's been around for 5,000 years, and this currency that's been around for 12 is going to take value out of something that's been pivotal and integral to humanity for quite a while. It is
all through the noughties. You'd go to gold conferences and people talk about gold and they talk about fiat money. And people would say fiat money is going to collapse. Gold's going to go to 5,000, 10,000. It's going to go to $100,000. There was these arguments that perpetrated by a guy called Jim Sinclair, who used to argue that gold's role was to rebalance the US national debt. So you take the US national debt and you divide it by US national gold holdings, and that is the price to which gold will go per ounce or per ton. And you used to come out at these numbers, 30, 40, $50,000 an ounce. And all the things that everyone said would happen to the gold price have happened to Bitcoin. They didn't happen to gold. And gold, meanwhile, is trading, it's trading lower than it was in 2011. And the chart looks horrible. Now, I do think the incredible transformation, like when historians come and look back at this period, they talk about the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution. This will be looked back on as the digital revolution. Because, 40 years ago, whatever, digital technology barely existed. And there's economic growth in the tangible economy and the physical economy, 3, 4, 5% a year, whatever it is. But the growth in the digital economy has eclipsed it. And a large part of that growth has been the fact that the digital economy has been the Wild West. There's been no government, there's been no regulator. So innovation and invention and everything else has been able to go on, without anyone having their hands tied. And, the market cap of, for example, of the 4 largest companies in Silicon Valley in 1990 compared to 2020, it was like 100 times higher. And so, and there's just a scalability to digital economy that there isn't in the physical economy. You look at, you invent a brilliant app and you upload it to the app store, that app can be downloaded 1 billion times. If you invent a brilliant, a brilliant cup, you've still got to manufacture 1 billion of those cups and send them out. So there's a scalability to digital that there isn't, and that's and because the economy grows so quick, it attracts more investment, and you have a sort of virtuous cycle. That's Google invents a really good algorithm, it starts using it straight away and scales it up, and so there's a scalability. So and I'm sure, and so in this world where you've got the physical economy and the digital economy, Bitcoin is the money of the digital economy. It's the borderless money of the internet. Gold is incredibly malleable. You can smash gold into a plate that's an atom thin. You can do anything you like to gold, but you can't destroy it. It is permanent. And that's so gold, in this incredible growth in the digital economy, gold is the single most analog asset there is. And when you start to look at it like that, you can see why. Now, gold was money for years. It was the horse was transport for years. And then suddenly somebody invents the combustion engine in the motor car, and the horse is just a sort of nice luxury.
Right.
Having been transport, since the centaurs. So I think that might be gold's problem. I've got this notion, though, like when I used to go to Bitcoin conferences in the noughties, I would go to gold conferences, and I would be 35, 40 years old, and I'd be the youngest person there. And then I'd go to Bitcoin conferences, and I'd be the oldest person there. And I was like right on the cusp of the divide between the two generations. And basically the over 55s, the over 60s, gold is the thing. And the under 50s, Bitcoin is the thing. And, it's a real generational thing. It's a generational thing. It's a physical, tangible thing. But gold's problem is that gold's problem in this economy is its single greatest quality, if you like. It's the fact that it's analog and it's useless.
Yeah, no, I agree. And we have some Bitcoin boomers. There's few of them, but they're around. And it's again, that generational divide is very stark. And it's like, what generation do you want to bet on, the ones coming up, or? And it is again, it's a shame because, like you said, you were at these conferences in the 90s, and these guys had the correct thesis and are right at the end of the day when it comes to the correct way to run a monetary system. I think a lot of them have been beating this drum for so long, and now we finally have this transition. It's becoming more apparent to more and more people that they were probably right, and they cling to the barbarous relic, as some people like to call it, and don't want to believe that this upstart digital currency can outcompete it. Again, like Bitcoin is just easier to verify, it's easier to send, it's more divisible. You can keep it in your mind. You don't have to walk around with heavy bricks. It's
By the way, that barbarous relic quote, Keynes was actually talking about the gold standard.
Was he?
He said the gold standard is a barbarous relic. He wasn't talking about gold itself. It's one of those things. Everyone says gold is the barbarous relic, but anyways, it's worth getting that little fact out there.
Oh, it's good to learn. It's good to know. I never knew that. I never knew it was referencing the standard.
I had a big argument with Jim Rickards once, and he started getting that quote out, and it was on stage at an economics conference, and he started saying he was talking about gold. I've got the book, and I said, what's the book called? And he couldn't tell you.
He doesn't like Bitcoin.
He doesn't, and he's wrong. The price has proved him wrong. I like Jim. I like the research he does. He's a good guy, but and I guess he's sticking to the gold narrative because that's his calling card, if you like. That's what's made him his money, and that's how he earns his living. But the proof is in the price,
right? And I mean, I think we're gonna have more proof as we move forward too. And again, like I mean, Bitcoiners, I don't pick on gold bugs or it's not even gold bugs particularly, but libertarians and free market folks who just have sat around and theorized and gone like to all these conferences and written all these articles, and they talk about what a free market system, libertarian reality may look like, but they never go and attempt to actually implement it. They put up libertarian candidates and hope that one of these election cycles, one of them will actually get enough excitement around them to be put in office. But it's just, you're not going to change that two-party system by participating in it. You need to implement free market ideas outside of that system, and Bitcoin does that better than anything out there. And so that's like one thing. It's like, hey, if you're an actual libertarian, you have this beautiful free market technology that you can access right now and start building on. And a lot of people, and even in those circles, hate on Bitcoin. It's like, this is literally the best tool to bring about the reality you want. And there's
Peter Thiel Peter Thiel wrote a good essay about this. It was in about 2009. I think it's kind of an okay essay actually, but because it comes from Peter Thiel, it carries more weight. If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'd written it, it probably would have been better written. But Peter Thiel carries considerably more weight than Dominic Frisby, and with good reason. He's a considerably better businessman. But anyway, I think it was called The Anatomy of a Libertarian or something like that. And he argued that you know, as I said earlier in the show, there's no point trying to achieve political change through politics. You have to do it through, you just can't, it takes too long and the process is too slow. You have to do it through new frontiers. And that might be new frontiers on the internet, in the digital world. It might be new frontiers at sea, seasteading. It might be new frontiers in space. You know, all these new, I keep saying the word frontiers, but all these new frontiers, and that's the way to do it. You achieve political change through technological change.
Agreed. I mean, that's why I focus on like as a millennial born in 1991, I was old enough to remember and vividly remember 9/11 and the push into Iraq and Afghanistan after that under false pretenses. I was 17 when the crash of 2008 happened, and happened to be taking an elective economics course while I was in high school right at that time as well. So as it was happening, we were talking about it pretty aggressively in class every day, and that's ingrained in my brain. And then you have the bailouts and QE, and went to work at a hedge fund, and just seeing all this stuff from the first 30 years of my life specifically, and how like time and time again, like the state and the powers that be have just failed miserably and robbed people blind and killed and murdered under false pretenses. It's really a red pilling moment, if you will. We're like, fuck these people. I don't want to try to change the world via their process. And having that mentality in 2013, 2014, when I found Bitcoin, I was like, all right, this is it. This is how we change the world. Like you take the power away from them and you use this distributed digital cash system.
Yeah. Bitcoin fixes this.
It does. It does. Well, like, I guess we can hop into that. Like, how does it reduce the state and their ability to tax in your mind? Like, how do you see this transition as we build this new system in parallel? It's separate from the traditional system. Like, how does it start to affect and erode their power?
The first thing is it's a system of money that is beyond state control and it's not beyond state regulation, but it's beyond state control, and they can't print and spend it when it suits them. So straight away, once government no longer has a money that it can print at will, its power is dramatically reduced. Secondly, it's like the canary in the coal mine. The Bitcoin price goes up because Michael Saylor's putting, $2.5 billion of corporate money into Bitcoin because it's a better store of wealth than the US dollar, and because he doesn't want the purchasing power of his currency eroded by 15% a year. And then on doing so, his stock price has gone up 5 times. That's a pretty powerful narrative, and a lot of corporations are going to be looking at the money that gets printed. They're going to be looking at their own balance sheets. That's a really strong narrative. And the more people that start saving in Bitcoin at the corporate level as well as at the individual level, rather than saving in fiat money, and now you can get 6% interest on your Bitcoins or 5%, whatever it is. That's a better rate of interest on a sound of money than 0.5% or 1% sticking it in the bank. And the more that narrative gets out, the more that forces governments to start financially offering. If they want to compete with Bitcoin, they're going to have to offer a sound of money, and a sound of money immediately puts a straitjacket on government and what it's able to do. So that's the third way that it does it. Or I've lost count of how many ways. But this is another big dynamic. We sort of touched on it earlier that I see taking place, which is that 50% of government revenue worldwide derives from income taxes. And income taxes have been an easy tax to collect in the physical economy. The whole tax structure is designed around the physical economy. A man or a woman goes to a place of work, and they have that same job, and they have that job for 5 or 10 or 15, whatever years it is. And the company collects that tax at source on behalf of the government. And so the man or the employee never actually, he doesn't collect his money and then pay some to the government. He has it removed to you. He never actually held that money in his hand himself. But there's been a dramatic change in the nature of work. And COVID has accelerated it, but it was a trend that was already in place. And that is the rise of the freelancer, the rise of the self-employed, the rise of the gig economy, the rise of the contingent worker. Pretty much every single, not every, but the large majority of people who work in Bitcoin are self-employed, contingent, freelance workers, whatever word you want to describe them as. And fewer people are working for one company for 5 or 10 years in the traditional way that our parents or grandparents may have done, with definite career paths. More and more people, and all the overwhelming evidence of LinkedIn, by the way, who's done loads of surveys on this, is that people actually prefer the flexibility of freelance work, even though it doesn't give them the same levels of security. And Ernst & Young have done loads of studies on it, the accountancy firm, EY, as they're now called, to use the groovy parlance. And they've estimated that by 2030, half of the US workforce will be contingent. In other words, only half will be full-time workers in a job. Now, it's much harder for governments to collect money from contingent workers than it is. The ease of collecting income tax goes when they have to collect the money after the event, so they have to rely on good reporting standards from the person who's paying taxes. Often there aren't good reporting standards, often there's incompetence, often there's fraud. They find many more expenses to write off against the taxes. So all these dynamics, and by the way, the acceleration of freelance work has it is accelerated thanks to the normalization of remote working remotely that COVID has made. Everything's done on Zoom. You no longer need to go into the office anymore. So that's accelerated this move into contingent freelance work. And so that places a pressure on government income because of this. The nature of work has changed. The nature of tax has to change as a result. Now, the next thing we're seeing the rise of is we touched on it, is more and more people moving to Florida or Texas because taxes are lower. And then gradually they'll just leave the United States. And in many cases, they might do a Roger Ver and abandon their nationality altogether. And in Europe, loads of people are moving to Cyprus and Malta and Portugal and all these low tax jurisdictions. And you just know that to pay for COVID and all the spending that's gone on COVID, higher taxes are coming. They've already levied the tax that is debt, which is a tax on the future. There's inflation. We get the CPI numbers next week, and they're going to be higher than expected. And CPI is a manipulated number because it's basically measuring Chinese deflation and improved productivity rather than measuring, the cost of things that people want, like houses and financial assets and all that. So, but anyway, even within the fraudulent remit of CPI, inflation isn't properly measured. But more and more people being digitally nomadic is again going to mean it's harder for governments to collect income taxes, and this is their biggest source of revenue. And meanwhile, all sorts of other jurisdictions, there will be a sort of competition between countries, and we want the Bitcoin economy here, we'll give you favorable legislation in order to attract it. And the overwhelming evidence of taxes is that people are actually happier to pay taxes if they're low. If you go to low flat rate, 15-20% income, often government revenue actually increases because more people pay. There's less fraud. It's easier to administer. People feel a greater loyalty to their country if the demands put on them aren't as great. The loyalty to low state, small state regimes throughout history has been much greater than the loyalty to totalitarian regimes, which people can't wait to abandon at the first opportunity. So, all these reasons will just put, they're all reasons where Bitcoin is going, and they're going to place pressure on governments. And, it's a good pressure because they will have to adapt, or they're going to have a very big problem on their hands. and they're going to have to lessen their obligations. They're going to have to stop spending as much, or if they're determined to spend as much, then they're going to have to get more and more totalitarian. By the way, that Sovereign Individual, that novel, it's so not novel, that book written in the 1990s, Lord Rees-Mogg, but he predicted this two-tier economy of the future, where the physical economy of people who can't move are going to have all the burdens of the state placed upon them, and there are going to be these sovereign nomadic individuals who flit from country to country, avoiding all these burdens. And it's happening in front of us.
Yeah, such a prescient book. And another interesting theme that's developed in the age of COVID, states' rights, states, like individual states under the federal government, sort of fighting for autonomy. I mean, we're seeing this with like states like Florida and now Texas, even Connecticut, South Dakota, just be like, all right, we're no more lockdowns, we're opening up, like, go live your lives. So you're seeing this at the state level sort of push back against the narrative being pushed by the federal government. Missouri, one county in Missouri, to protect Second Amendment rights, said it's now legal, or excuse me, it is legal for sheriff's departments to arrest federal agents who come in trying to take people's guns away. And now with Bitcoin specifically, we're seeing legislation get passed in particular states. Just this week, Kentucky is waiving the sales tax on energy converted by Bitcoin miners. So if Bitcoin miners come into Kentucky and plug in their machines, they get a tax break on the sales tax of the energy that they buy. We're seeing a similar bill get put through the legislator in North Dakota, where if for specifically what we do, if oil and gas producers leverage Bitcoin mining to reduce their flare in the field, they will get a tax break as well, tax credit specifically. I won't be surprised if we see something similar in states like Wyoming and Texas. But you have, and that's something that makes me hopeful as an American, is that maybe we can get like a return to state autonomy and giving more power back to the states.
I've got to say, that's one thing that America's got for it that Europe doesn't have, which is the autonomy of states, and that enables competition between states, and that competition will improve. It will just improve matters. That's a real advantage. And in fact, I think that's one of the reasons why America was and is so great, is that the competition between states improved practice generally. The one strong dynamic we've seen over the last 130 years in America and elsewhere is that 140 years ago, it was roughly a balance of 50% of taxes levied at the federal level and 50% of taxes levied at the local level. But now the percentage of taxes levied at the local level has got much smaller, and the percentage of taxes levied at the federal level has grown much bigger. And it's harder to, it's easier to keep your local tax collectors. And that's not because taxes levied at the local level have got any lower. It's just that federal taxes have grown that much more. And it's harder to keep a centralized federal body to hold them to account in the same way it is local bodies. One of the reasons, the large state model works better in Scandinavia than anywhere else is that a lot of taxes are collected and spent locally. So local people can actually see the effect of their taxes and hold the people who are spending their money to account. And whereas in the UK, which is, all taxes are paid at this, it's like 1 or 2% is taxes are paid locally, and the large majority are paid at the central level. It's just impossible to hold anyone to account except with a vote every few years, which doesn't make any difference to anything anyway. So that's a big advantage that America has. And the more power that the states claw back for themselves, like Florida and Texas, as a result of the influx of people from New York and California, and a lot of those people are simply moving to escape not only high taxes but high property costs, which is another form of tax, really. Florida and Texas are going to see extraordinary booms as a result, and then the other states will see the booms that Florida and Texas are having, and they'll go, oh, actually, we want a piece of that, and so they'll start competing. So you should see some sort of competition to drive down taxes, at least at the local level, but you've still got the federal problem.
Yeah.
But by the way, you'll get to this chapter when you come to the US Civil War, but Americans You know, they don't like being told their history by foreigners, particularly if they've got an English accent. But, you know, retrospectively, the Civil War's been painted as this huge fight over slavery. And, you know, whether it, but the North didn't go to war with the South. And I know the South shot the first bullet, but they were sort of induced into doing that. The biggest the reason the South wanted secession to protect its economic interests is that they felt they were paying 90% of federal taxes, but most of their taxes that they were paying, the money was being spent in the North. And they were sick at, 50 years of economic injustice. So there's a tax story in the lead up to the American Civil War that is very rarely told. And that's one of the things I do in Daylight Robbery. You'll get to that chapter, but I hope I've thrown a very different light on the causes of the American Civil War to that which is, most commonly told in certainly in US schools.
Yeah.
I'm not saying slavery was an issue, because it was a huge issue, but there's a huge untold story about taxes, and the same dynamic, excess taxes, is perhaps driving these new successionist movements.
I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. It's not shocking actually to hear, and I think that's an important context to get out there. And actually, as you're describing it, it reminds me a lot of the EU and how that tax structure works, and it flows from north to south with Germany really subsidizing the Italies and the Greeces of the European economic union.
Yeah, one of the ways the EU is trying to grow its power is it's trying to take control of taxes. It hates excuse my language, it hates Ireland, for example, and the low corporation tax that Ireland offers. And it's desperately trying to set centralized tax rates so that there's no tax competition between EU nations. It's trying to standardize VAT rates. VAT is basically like our sales tax. And as it does that, its power will grow.
Yeah, but it is the EU blows my mind. I think it's one of the worst. I mean, I get you want the free flow of labor between borders, but I mean, like Greece and Italy,
it started well and ended badly.
Yeah, I mean,
and it hasn't ended yet.
One of my favorite Michael Lewis books is Boomerang, and the way he describes how Goldman Sachs and other investment banks literally helped countries like Greece and Italy cook the books to get their debt to GDP ratios in a position that allowed them to get into the EU, and then they did, and they're basically bankrupt nations that are dragging down people, more productive members of the EU and other parts of the region. Yeah, it's again the state growing and metastasizing and
yeah, I mean, that's one of the, I'm quite proud of Britain voting to leave. It was one, I wasn't expecting that to happen. I have another hat where I sort of work as a stand-up comedian, and I wrote a song about Brexit that nearly got to #1 in the UK charts. And the chorus of the song went, "The English told them to fuck off." And but it was a very popular song. I keep swearing. Do you need to? I beg your pardon.
You're fine. This is
okay.
A curse.
But yeah, it was such a funny, because nobody was expecting that vote. Even the people who voted for it were like, this isn't going to happen. And then it did. It shows you just how out of touch the media and everything else is.
Well, look how angry they got.
Yeah, and then they tried to stop it. They spent 3 years trying to stop the whole thing happening.
Well, it proves how much control they want. It's not really, they don't care about the well-being of the Englishman. They care about being able to take his tax dollars and throw it back into the EU somehow.
Sure they do.
And again, like you mentioned, the media and everybody being pissed, like it highlights their disconnect from like real society. And it's again like another reason why we should limit the federal government as much as possible. Like here in the US, like DC, like they're making all these decisions and they're completely detached from the information source of the economy. Like they're making decisions on behalf of states across the whole country, and they don't even like really understand like how they're affecting, or what, more importantly, what individuals in different states need. And they're so far away from the source of information. How could they ever make accurate and good decisions, particularly economic decisions? And similarly with the EU, like everybody sits in Brussels or wherever they meet, and they make these decisions for people all across the region, and they really don't understand they're detached from the information that should be feeding their decisions.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the I think I don't know that much about American politics, but I do think the Republicans losing Congress was a big blow, because at least when one party held Congress and the other held the Senate, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
There's a sort of healthy standoff between the two, but now the Democrats have got control of everything. That can't be good.
Yeah, they're gonna try and force feed everything through. And honestly, like I've been so focused. That's the beauty of Bitcoin too. It's like I just focus on Bitcoin. It's like, all right, they're gonna accelerate the demise of federal government in the US dollar system. Like let's focus just on building over Bitcoin. Like I honestly don't care what they do anymore. Like they can.
Yeah,
they
it's
can try
just
all they
like
want.
I'm like that with the news. I don't follow the news at all. I've got a list of people I follow on Twitter, and then I've got a Bitcoin list, and I don't even bother with the main list now because it just stresses me out watching them all argue about some government policy or COVID or this or that. I'm just like, you guys, you're not going to change anything arguing on Twitter. And so I just go straight to my Bitcoin and my gold and my investment lists, which are, things that I'm actually interested in and can do something about.
Right. And that's the other thing that pisses me off about these centralized federal governments and these big state apparatuses is that people want them to bring the change into the world. Nobody ever wants to take action and do it themselves. Most people, at least, obviously Bitcoiners and other individuals, like you're a Bitcoiner too. So like people like us, like are doing this. Like you don't go to the state and ask them to bring the change that you want to see in the world. Go be the change. And that's like the perplexing thing for me, particularly as we sit at this stage, at this particular juncture in the digital age, the early part of the digital age, the earliest part. We're still in the first half of the first inning for baseball reference there, but there's never been a better opportunity to make the world a better place on your own. Like you don't need to allocate these decisions to politicians in the state. You can use the technology at your fingertips to build it. Like
that's a really good slogan. Don't demand the change, be the change.
Right.
But I mean, people imbue government in the state. I think it's because the whole election process, when that happens, all these politicians make promises. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I don't know, maybe that's not, I don't know what the reasons, but people imbue government with all these powers to fix things that it just doesn't have. And that's assuming it even had the will, which in most cases it doesn't. And so, I come back to daylight robbery and taxation. If a politician really wanted to change the world, and presumably a lot of politicians go into politics and they at least start out with that intention, and, reality perhaps corrupts them or diverts them from their initial intention. But there must be some politics who go in with good intentions and genuinely want to change the world and make it better. If they all focused their efforts on changing the tax system and designing a tax system for utopia, then everything else would take care of itself. Everything else would follow from that. But instead, they argue about this policy or that policy or this regulation, this, but that doesn't change anything. But change the way we're taxed, and you really can reform the world at the political level.
Well, they're all trying to change the way you're taxed, but they're just going the other direction.
I mean, I do think some tax is inevitable, as I said, but you can have much lower taxes. You can have much flatter taxes. There's a great template there in the form of Hong Kong, which was the economic growth story of the second half of the 20th century. It grew at such an astonishing rate that Singapore copied it, Taiwan copied it, even China copied it, and eventually Shenzhen and South Korea copied it to a certain extent. Even Japan. As much government revenue in Hong Kong derived from taxing land as we derive in the West from taxing income. So we rely on 50% of government revenue derives from income tax out in the West. In fact, around the world, pretty much. Whereas in Hong Kong, it was actually just over 40% derived from taxing the value of land. And that's not what's built on the land. It's the land as though there was nothing on it. And so, and tax as a percentage of GDP never exceeded 14% in Hong Kong. And it was only the richest people that paid income tax. Ordinary workers didn't pay income tax. Can you imagine that? Ordinary workers paid no income tax. And, you know, Hong Kong was this incredible growth story, and they achieved that. And Hong Kong's tax code is 1.5% the length of the UK's tax code. 1.5%. The UK's tax code is something like 14 times the length of the Bible. It's even longer than America's tax code. It's just absurd. We've got the longest tax code in the world. And you know, and it's more words than most people read in their entire lifetime. And Hong Kong's tax code is 1.5%. And it achieved that extraordinary economic growth. Its population went from 700,000 to over 10 million, or no, maybe over 9 million, I think. You know, it had extraordinary population growth, and, you know, some might see that as a bad thing. Some might see it as a good thing, but it was an incredible booming economy, and fortunes were made. And this was in the pre-digital age. On a per capita GDP basis, Hong Kong was on a level with most of Africa at the end of the Second World War. And by the 1990s, it had overtaken the UK, and by the noughties, it had overtaken America per capita GDP. Better education, better healthcare, better transport. And it was all achieved with taxation never exceeding 14% of GDP, no income tax for low earners, and taxing the value of land instead of the value of labor. It's an entirely different way of taxing people. And, you know, the template is there.
Right. It is. And I hate taxes. You're speaking to somebody who has to do their taxes over the course of the next 6 weeks or delay. It's never easy to pay your taxes too.
Oh, it's such a headache. It's so much work. It's cost so much. You know, my accountant, her whole business model is just organizing other people's tax returns, and she does it brilliantly, but it's not productive. I'm paying money to her to pay money to the government. She's not actually creating a new thing in the world. It's just reallocation. That's not me having to go at her, by the way, because I love her, but it's, you know, tax has become this boring thing that is the domain of accountants that people just hate. And, you know, some Bitcoiners actually get pretty vindictive about it, but most people just sort of pay it and try and forget about it. But the reality is, once you start to look at the world through the prism of tax, and you look at the impact of tax on history, how tax has designed the world in which we live today, how the world's going to look in the future as a result of taxation, you suddenly think, wow, this is one of the most fascinating subjects in the world, and we should study taxation at school the same way we study English and maths and science. You know, there's never been a civilization without taxation of some kind. And, you know, there were civilizations where taxation was voluntary, in ancient Greece, for example, but nevertheless, there was still taxation. And, you know, I that's why I wrote a book about it, and I keep banging on about it. It's so important, and it could be so interesting if more people start talking about it.
All right. Well, thank you for writing the book. I think I agree more people need to start talking about this. And again, going back to your theory that like Bitcoin mining is going to help start these like more distributed societies at the energy source, right? Like, and think about that. Like if you get like these autonomous little cities that are bootstrapped with Bitcoin mining operations that create a revenue flow that allow you to just create like a circular local economy with a revenue source, with a money printing source, not money printing, but like a money production source, if you will, in the form of Bitcoin mining. It could lead to much more better local decision making and get us away from. Right?
And they'll have to get armies to protect them from the marauding state invaders of the country in whose jurisdiction the mines are in. But they'll be able to afford them and pay for them. But yeah, I mean, I hadn't. The more you think about this and the implications of it, you know, these might be these remote parts of wherever it is, Siberia or Africa or somewhere where there is cheap, unutilized energy. You know, at what point the Bitcoin miners could say, do you know what, can we buy this land off you, government, and set up our own nation state? And you might see these little city states, these energy city states arise, these citadels of the future. It could be fantastic.
Right. And there's another good book I've read in the last year called Strong Towns by an economist named Charles Marone. he describes how the city of Minneapolis came to be in Minnesota here in the United States, and it essentially reminds me of what we're talking about here with Bitcoin miners. Is a bunch of lumberjacks just hopped off a train, headed west, and started cutting down trees. And that's like how the city started. They started cutting down trees, putting it on the train. They built a church, they built a corner store, they built a bar, and turned into like one of the biggest cities in the United States.
You often see cities around mines, communities build up around mines as long as the mines remain operational. Many of the cities of Glasgow, huge amount of Glasgow's wealth. Glasgow was the second city of the British Empire. It was the second richest city in Europe at one point. It's a dump now, but so much of Glasgow was built around coal. And you look at most cities, many cities, they're built on a river. And because the river was the source of transport, it was the source of energy, it was the source of food. Most major cities in the world, Rome, Paris, London, they've all got a huge river flowing through them. And the river was the livelihood, and maybe the livelihood of the future will be the cheap energy and the Bitcoin mines.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about Egypt earlier. Egypt right off the Nile. So
sure.
Are you optimistic about the future?
You've got to be. You've got to look back at life and you've got to go, actually, I've been born at the best time in history, and everyone born after me has been born in an even better time, because the free market has just made life so much better. It's given us so much more. And on the one hand, you can argue that we are less free because the state is bigger than ever and we're taxed more than ever and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, technology has made us more free than we've ever been. Google and the internet has given us access to more information than we've ever had. The mobile phone has enabled us to communicate in a way that we've never had. We can, I've got on my desk a sound studio and a television studio that would have cost millions of pounds once upon a time, and technology has just made it possible for a few $100. So I can fly anywhere in the world. I'll soon be able to fly to space. I can drive anywhere. So all technology is this incredibly liberating force, but at the same time, we're trapped in this eternal dance between those who tell you you can't do something and would tax you, and those who would do something and go away and experiment and do stuff. So you've got to be more positive, and the later you're born, the luckier you are, in a funny kind of way. And you can say, oh, maybe the baby boomers were luckier than people born after 1990 or whatever, because the baby boomers got cheap houses, and you go, yeah, well, fair enough. But then the people born after 1990 got Bitcoin. So there's you've got to say life in many ways get better and better and better. There are all sorts of things that were wonderful in the past that I think we've lost: big families, community, community spirit. I'm really into I said I meant write songs, and I'm really impressed with all these sea shanties that have been doing the rounds on Twitter. I think they're great. And then you realize how those sea shanties came about is that, there were people working on ships, and they would sing these songs, and they're all done to a sort of heave-ho rhythm, pulling a rope, and they've all got this thing. So they were all work songs, basically. Now, can you imagine being on a ship in, I don't know, 1750 or whatever year it is. And before there was coal or any kind of power, you were sailing with the wind. It was just you on this ship with your fellow men, sailing into the winds, discovering new worlds. You must have felt this, with dolphins chasing the ship. It just must have been incredibly exciting world to be alive in, with this incredible camaraderie as you all sang songs in the ship. Just must have been an amazing existence. Now that's completely gone. So I suppose you could say, well, we've lost that, and that's very sad. But there are all sorts of other things that we have. We live longer than ever. We're more aware of how the body works than ever. And, so we've lost a lot, but we've also, ultimately, you have to be positive.
Yeah. No, I agree. We have lost a lot. But I think the money perturbs it. Like, look at the culture. Yeah, the songs we have now is like Percocets. Like, this was like one of the, literally one of the biggest songs in America, like a few years ago. It was a song about taking opioids. And it's like, the culture has been degraded so much. I think it stems from the monetary policy, like beyond music, like the housing and building and sculpting has been severely
I couldn't
diminish
agree more.
equality.
You look at the destruction of communities and its relation to architecture, and then you just, even with something like daylight robbery, you know, because windows were taxed, it informed the way architecture works, and because then people had houses without windows, they had worse lives. So,
Right.
you know,
Less ventilation.
that's tax rather than money. But yeah, I'm sure the money is the blood of a society, and it needs to be sound, it needs to be clean, it needs to be pure. And fiat money is none of those things. It is diseased, and it has enabled all sorts of things that should never have been able to happen. And as the state grows, the family erodes, because the state starts becoming responsible for things that the family should be responsible for, whether it's charity, education, healthcare, any of those things. As soon as they fall into the stand of the state, you create a dependency culture. Those things aren't as done as well as caringly as they would be if they would be by a member of a family. You know, it's no coincidence that we've seen the decline of morals, the rise of divorce rates. All these things have got worse the more that fiat money is debased. Despite all of that, you still have to be positive.
Yeah, we have Bitcoin. Bitcoin. It's going to change the world, hopefully. It is changing the world.
I'm going to do a song. Do you understand non-fungible tokens?
I mean, I understand how they work. I think it's a fad. I don't think people are I think the evaluations of some of these tokens are pretty insane and nonsensical right now. I think it's similar.
Are they the you know, to this Bitcoin boom what altcoins were in 2016?
Yeah, and what ICOs were in 2016.
They're more like ICOs, aren't they? Yeah.
Altcoins were in 2013, 2014. I
All
think so. There may be a place for them. And that's the other thing. NFTs have been around since 2014. People don't realize, like, it's nothing
I got
new.
burnt. I bought a load of a coin called WorldCoin in 2013. I wonder what happened to them.
Right, exactly. I mean, they're like, yeah, I'm going to focus on stacking Bitcoin. People can make their own financial decisions and get into NFTs. I mean, it's a cool idea, but whether or not the value that they're going for right now is justified, I'm highly skeptical.
Will there be NFTs? And what would you say? How many Bitcoins do you need to have to be a Bitcoin whale?
I mean,
1,000, 100?
Like a whale, probably like 1,000. Yeah, at least.
Okay.
So
100, you're only a senior or something like that.
Yeah, 100. I mean, for anybody listening to this, like, you don't have to strive to be a whale. If you have 1 Bitcoin, you're going to be pretty well off. There's 21 million Bitcoin. There's 47 million millionaires in the world. Like, even if they all wanted one, they couldn't. So
I think you should aim to get 0.21 Bitcoins, then aim to get 2.1 Bitcoins, then aim to get up to 21 Bitcoins and so on, 210.
Just start somewhere. Keep stacking.
So, and will there be NFTs? Like, all the NFTs sites I've looked at are all built around Ethereum. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and the gas fees have created a real problem, because if you want to list your NFT, often the gas fee of listing it costs you more than the NFT will actually sell for. You know, if you just want to put some stupid little gizmo up there that somebody can buy for $5, you know, it costs you 50 quid to get it up there. Sorry, $50, $50. So
that's a big.
Will there be like BTC based NFTs?
Yeah,
is that coming?
The first NFTs were built on a Merge Mine sidechain, I believe. It's a Merge Mine sidechain and Counterparty. So like Rare Pepe's was the first NFT ever launched, I believe, and it happened on Bitcoin. And and there are people working on, believe it or not, third layer technology on top of Bitcoin. So to do the Bitcoin protocol level, then Lightning, and then there's this protocol that's being worked on called RGB, which allows you to do color coins, which could bring NFTs to market, and those fees would be severely reduced, because you're not going to be trading them on chain like Ethereum and paying all that gas. It'd be pushed up to a third layer, and they'd be leveraging the Lightning network to distribute and move all of those tokens. So the fees would be significantly less.
I've got a song video that I've made, or just have nearly finished, and it's a thing I did in my stand-up act a few years ago. But I did a show called Libertarian Love Songs, and at the beginning of the show, I would make the audience all stand up and sing the Libertarian National Anthem. And it's done to the music of the Russian National Anthem, because I thought, A, because it's a really good song, and B, because I thought it was really, B, because it's out of copyright, and C, because I thought it was really funny that the Libertarian Anthem should be to the hymn of the Bolshevik Party. Anyway, so we've recorded the song, and we've got a whole choir singing it, and it sounds absolutely fantastic. And we've made this brilliant video. And normally, like, I have a sort of little side business where I put song videos up on YouTube, but I'm thinking this video could have real value as an NFT. You know, some very principled old school whale or something, you know, might, you know, who's trying to build a citadel, he might want this as the anthem for his citadel. Do you know what I mean? I think it would have real value. But like, I can't quite see, I'd rather it was, I can't quite, I don't know what to do. I don't know whether to stick it on Rareable, on this, a couple of the big NFT sites are curated. So I can't quite see what to do. Do you think a song video could even have value as an NFT?
I mean, like, I guess so. I mean, it's proven in the meat space where, like, the Wu-Tang Clan, they sold a non-fungible album. It was 101, but they did that just in meat space in the real world. And it has value because only one person has that. It was actually Martin Shkreli, believe it or not, at one point.
And can anyone else listen to it? I
mean, if you go over to someone's house and they play it on the turntable, and the person that owns it, yeah, you can listen to it. But I guess you could bring your phone and try to record it secretly and then get it out to the world.
Yeah. But then the song only has, because it's a bit like selling the song rights, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so like,
if you own the song, you want, like, if you own the Mona Lisa, you want as many people to see the Mona Lisa as possible, because then it has more value, doesn't it?
Exactly. And so I think one thing I think the NFT art world is missing the problem. They're trying to make all the scarce non-fungible tokens, but everything will get screenshotted and recorded, and it'll be shared anyway. And the person, like, who has the hash token, it's like, ooh, I actually own it. It's like, cool, like, who cares? Like, you can all access this. So, like, the artist will get paid at the end of the day, but their art will get out there, and you'll just have some clout chaser be like, I actually own it. Where I think Bitcoin and the Lightning Network specifically fixes DRM, where, like, so for instance, this podcast that we're recording right now, it's going to be distributed on an app called Sphinx Chat, and the Sphinx Chat app is plugged into the Lightning Network. So in our RSS feed that goes out, that sends this podcast out to all the platforms, we've embedded a Lightning Network public node, public key node, or node public key, excuse me, into our RSS feed. So when we send our RSS feed, we say, hey, here's our podcast, here's the file, here's our Lightning public key. And with this app Sphinx Chat, it picks up that Lightning public key, and it is also a Lightning wallet. And so it picks up our podcast, and as individuals who are listening to the podcast on Sphinx right now listen, every minute they listen, they stream us sats. So like 10 sats every minute, 40 sats every minute, 50 sats, depending on how much value they get out of listening to this podcast. So similarly,
they have to press a button to give you the sats, do they?
No, it's all automatically streaming. They're streaming it to us automatically. They can press a button as they listen if they like a particular part of the episode, and they want to tip us for the idea we brought. It can boost and send us a little more sats. It's called, and so, like, plugging that into an artist, particularly like a music artist, you could do something similar where you just host a file somewhere and you say, hey, if you want to access this file, you have to pay me a few sats as you listen, or something like that. More and more people will access it. You'll be getting paid by everybody instead of that one clout chaser who wants to hold the NFT. I personally think that's a better model. In the long run. Yeah.
I'm still going to look into sticking it on Rareable or whatever. I want to do it on that one that's owned by the Winklevoss twin. What's the one that's owned by the
I don't know.
Nifty Gateway or something. That seems to be where all the big bucks are.
I mean, everybody's making a lot of money right now. I think get it while you can. I think.
Yeah.
I don't think the valuations of these NFTs are going to last very long and sustain the levels that they're at right now. But people are hopping on the craze. And it's typical like Ethereum, ICO, altcoin, like hype cycles. Like you have insiders, VC interests particularly, that have invested in these platforms, these protocols. And I would not be surprised at all if they're artificially pumping these prices to get like hype around it and drive other people to spend money on it.
Yeah. That all makes sense. The thing is, there's so many people saying it's a bubble at the moment. Normally when there's that many people saying it's a bubble, it carries on going up.
All right. No, I mean,
people have been saying Tesla's a bubble for 2 years and it only finally seems to be popping now. But anyway, there's no golden rule.
Yeah. I mean, you're the artist. It's up to you, like how you want to do it. Like it's for me, like maybe I am an artist with this podcast. Like I like getting sat streamed to me via Sphinx and potentially other apps in the future. But as somebody, as a collector of digital tokens, the only token I plan on collecting for the foreseeable future is Bitcoin, because I think it's going to outperform anything, especially NFTs.
It's got the network.
Right. It's been a fascinating
Marty, I'm getting looks from my other half through the other side of the door. She looks like she's calling me to dinner or some kind of Friday night activity. So I might politely drop out of the conversation.
Well, I know that pressure. I'm sorry for again pushing this a little later than I expected and you expected. So I thank you for being flexible there. It's been a fascinating conversation. Where can we find out more about you? Daylight Robbery. Where can people pick up the book?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Marty. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm very grateful to you. And all my books are available on Amazon, and Daylight Robbery being the most recent. But if you're into audiobooks, you can get the audiobook on, Audible and iTunes and all the usual places. And all my audiobooks are read by me, and I've got a long history in sound studios and voiceovers and all that kind of thing. So I like to think I have read them pretty well. And the audiobooks it's got 4.9. It's had like over 200 reviews, and it's got an average of 4.9, which I think is pretty good for an audiobook. So a lot of people say the audiobook's really good. So anyway, I recommend it. And I also want to just plug one other audiobook, if that's all right, called The Shadow Punk Revolution, which is an audiobook I made late last year. And the whole thing's a metaphor for Bitcoin. And I had this idea that media format is determined by the media that's available at the time. So the album grew, for example, as a result of 33 RPM records and replacing 78, where you can only have one song on each side. And so the album grew as a format, and then the internet came along and iTunes and Spotify and all the rest of it and destroyed the album as a format. It was replaced with the playlist. But I used to love the old 70s concept albums and the relation, things like the War of the Worlds, where there'd be music and voice. I always thought it was a fantastically powerful medium. And I've also got this idea that in this, the brain absorbs information better through the ear than it does through the page. And that explains why there's this we only invented writing as a means of transformation over distance and time. But the brain is better geared through the ear. And that's why we're having this huge boom in podcasts, if that makes sense. And so with all this in mind, I produced this story called The Shadow Punk Revolution. And it's a sci-fi rock drama. It's voice and music, a bit like the War of the Worlds. And it's set in the future. And it's all about this gang of techno anarchic inventors who were very worried about state and corporate invasion of privacy. And so they invent these new invisibility coats to defend against privacy. And obviously the whole thing's a metaphor for Bitcoin. And this one police inspector discovers that drug dealers have been using these invisibility coats to deal drugs in his area. And all the local youth population are being destroyed and corrupted by these terrible drugs that are coming from the cities and destroying this rural community. So he goes on this mission to get to the bottom of what these invisibility cloaks are. And it's, you know, as I say, the whole thing's the metaphor for Bitcoin and finding Satoshi and all this kind of thing. And it's called, and it's about how, you know, Bitcoin, for all its many qualities, it did enable a lot of nefarious activity to take place on the dark net. Some of which may be wrong, but you know, I think drugs should be legalized personally, but you know, there's a lot of bad shit that goes on the dark net that Bitcoin has enabled. And so there is a slight moral dilemma there. And hopefully this investigates that, but it's a sci-fi rock drama about invisibility, and any Bitcoiners who are into rock musicals will love it.
Hell yeah. Well, go check it out, freaks. Dominic, thank you for your time. I see you getting the evil eyes from your wife, even though I can't see her. So I'll let you get back to your Friday night.
She lives in your mind, thanks to the power of the ear to absorb information. Thanks very much, Marty. I'll see you soon.
Have a good one. Can't wait to do it again.
You too. Cheers. Me too. Oh, that was my dog.